She called the Alpha King handsome. He locked the door and roared, "Mine! You think this is a game, little bird?" The voice was a low rumble, vibrating through the heavy oak door before the lock clicked shut with a sound like a guillotine dropping. Renford Ashthorne backed away, his silk slippers sliding on the polished marble until his spine hit the cold, unyielding wall. The room smelled of ozone, cedar, and a terrifying, restrained violence. "I merely spoke the truth, Your Majesty," Renford whispered, his breath hitching as a shadow detached itself from the gloom. King Xyla Frostborn stepped into the light, his eyes burning with a chaotic mix of fury and starvation. He slammed his hand against the wall by Renford's head, shattering the plaster. "You called the monster handsome," Xyla growled, his face inches from Renford's. "And now the monster refuses to let you leave." The Winter Palace of Oakhaven was not built for warmth. It was built for intimidation. Great spires of black stone pierced the grey sky like accusatory fingers, and the wind that howled through the corridors carried the scent of pine and ancient secrets. For Renford Ashthorne, a low-ranking archivist from the Southern Territories, the palace felt less like a home and more like the inside of a wolf's throat. Renford adjusted the silver mask on his face, the cool metal biting into his skin. He was nobody here, an Omega without a patron, invited to the Grand Solstice Masquerade only because his employer, the elderly historian Yestin Moorhart, had taken ill and required Renford to deliver the annual tedious report on lineage and taxation to the royal steward. He was supposed to deliver the scroll and leave, but the snow had come down in a white curtain, sealing the mountain pass, and protocol dictated that stranded guests must attend the ball. "Don't look at them directly, Ren," Yestin had warned him before he left, coughing into a handkerchief. "The Frostborns are not like us. The king, they say the ice in his veins has frozen his heart solid. One wrong look, and you'll disappear." Renford stood in the shadow of a massive stone pillar, clutching a glass of sparkling cider he was too nervous to drink. The ballroom was a swirling galaxy of velvet, diamonds, and dangerous ambition. Alphas prowled the floor in military dress, their scents aggressive and cloying, musk, leather, spice. Betas moved between them like currents of water, facilitating the flow of power. And the Omegas, draped in silks that cost more than Renford's life earnings, played the role of exquisite ornaments. "Look at him," a voice hissed to Renford's left. It was Petra Kingsfall, a minor noble with a reputation for cruelty and a tongue sharper than a skinning knife. She was speaking to her companion, Zevran Witshaw, the king's grand advisor. Zevran was a man who smiled too much, his eyes remaining dead and flat like a shark's. Renford followed their gaze toward the throne. Sitting there, slumped in a posture of bored lethargy, was King Xyla Frostborn. He was not wearing a mask. He didn't need to. His face was his shield. He had a scar running from his temple to his jaw, a jagged white line disrupting the rugged symmetry of his features. His hair was black as a raven's wing, swept back from a forehead etched with perpetual tension. Rumors said he was cursed, that he had killed his own brother for the crown, that he shifted into a beast when the moon was full. "A brute," Petra sneered, though she kept her voice low. "Look how he grips that goblet. He looks ready to crush it. No wonder no Omega will bond with him. He reeks of death." Zevran chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "He is useful for war, Petra, but for court, he is a blunt instrument. Ugly inside and out." Renford felt a strange, hot prickle of irritation. He looked at the king again. He didn't see a brute. He saw a man who looked exhausted. He saw the way Xyla's eyes scanned the room, not with predatory hunger, but with the wary vigilance of someone who expects a knife in the back at any moment. The scar didn't make him ugly. It made him real. It proved he had bled, that he was flesh and bone, not just a symbol of terror. The king's jaw was tight, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the stone ceiling. There was a tragic, jagged beauty to him, a lonely peak amidst a range of soft, treacherous hills. Without thinking, caught in the spell of the music and the wine and his own contrarian nature, Renford murmured, "You're wrong." Petra and Zevran turned to him, blinking as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. "Excuse me?" Petra snapped, her fan snapping shut. "Who are you?" Renford realized his mistake, but his pride, the trait that had gotten him into trouble his entire life, refused to let him back down. He straightened his spine, meeting the Grand Advisor's dead eyes. "I said you're wrong," Renford said, his voice carrying slightly over a lull in the music. "He doesn't look like a brute. If you look past the scar, he has kind eyes. He's quite handsome, actually. Perhaps the most handsome man in the room, if only because he's the only one not wearing a mask of deceit." The silence that followed was instant and absolute. It rippled outward from their corner like a shockwave. The orchestra seemed to falter. Renford felt the blood drain from his face. He hadn't meant for it to be so loud. Petra looked horrified. Zevran looked amused, a cruel smirk touching his lips. But it was the sensation of being watched that made Renford's knees weak. He slowly turned his head back toward the throne. King Zyla was standing. The goblet was gone. His hands were empty, hanging at his sides, clenched into fists. Across the expanse of the ballroom, through the haze of candlelight and perfume, the Alpha King's eyes locked onto Renford. They were blue, piercing, electric, impossible blue. And they were wide with shock. Someone gasped. The crowd parted, creating a wide, terrified aisle between the low-born archivist and the ruler of the North. "Run!" a voice in Renford's head screamed. But he couldn't move. He was pinned by that blue gaze, trapped in the gravity of a star about to go supernova. Zyla stepped off the dais, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, a slow, predatory rhythm that matched the frantic beating of Renford's heart. The walk from the ballroom to the king's private study was a blur of terrified impressions. Renford remembered the feeling of a heavy hand on his elbow, not striking him, but steering him with an implacable force. He remembered the collective intake of breath from the court as the king himself escorted the nobody out of the hall. He remembered Zevran Whitshaw's eyes, narrowing with calculation, realizing a pawn had just entered the board. Now, the heavy oak door slammed shut, sealing out the music and the whispers. The lock clicked. Renford backed away until he hit the wall. The study was massive, filled with books that reached the ceiling, maps of war, and the lingering scent of wood smoke and something sweeter, something intense. Zyla stood by the door, his chest heaving. Up close, he was enormous. The stories didn't do justice to the sheer physical density of him. He radiated heat, a furnace burning beneath the black military tunic. "Who sent you?" Zyla demanded. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. "No one, Your Majesty," Renford managed to say, his hands trembling as he held them up in surrender. "I am Renford Ashthorne, an archivist for historian Moorhart. I only came to deliver papers." "Liar." Zyla crossed the room in 2 strides, invading Renford's personal space. The air around them seemed to crackle with static electricity. "No one speaks kindly of me in this court. No one. They fear me. They want my crown or my death. So tell me, little bird, whose dagger are you hiding?" "I have no dagger," Renford cried out, fear giving way to indignant sparks. "And I don't lie. I observe. It is my job." "You observe?" Zyla laughed, a harsh, humourless sound. He braced his hands on the wall on either side of Renford's head, boxing him in. And what do you observe now? A monster, a beast ready to tear you apart. Renford forced himself to look up. He looked past the anger, past the scar that twisted the king's lip. He saw the tremor in Zyla's hands. He saw the dilation of his pupils, not just rage, but adrenaline. I see a man who is lonely, Renford whispered, the truth slipping out before he could stop it. And I see a man who is tired of everyone assuming the worst. Zyla froze. The air left his lungs in a rush. The aggressive posture didn't change, but the tension in his muscles shifted. He leaned in closer, dropping his head so his nose brushed against Renford's neck. Renford gasped. The contact was electric. A jolt went straight down his spine, curling his toes. "You smell," Zyla murmured, inhaling deeply. "You smell like old paper and rainwater. Why do you smell like peace?" "I don't know," Renford breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You called me handsome." Zyla pulled back slightly, his blue eyes searching Renford's face, scanning every inch of his unmasked skin. "Did you mock me? Was it a jest for your friends?" "I have no friends here," Renford said softly, "and I never jest about the truth. You have a strong face. You look capable and sad. I find that compelling." The admission hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Zyla closed his eyes. A shudder went through his massive frame. For years, the curse of his bloodline, the volatile, high-octane alpha aggression, had made him a pariah. Even those who sought his power flinched at his touch. He was the Winter King, cold and untouchable. But this Omega, this small, sharp-tongued creature with eyes like autumn leaves, he didn't flinch. Something inside Zyla, something ancient and dormant, snapped. It was the sound of a chain breaking. His eyes snapped open. The blue was gone, swallowed by a dark, encompassing black. The scent in the room spiked. Burnt sugar, ozone, and pure, unfiltered dominance. "Run," Zyla warned, his voice a guttural growl that wasn't entirely human. "Run now, Renford, before I decide you cannot leave." Renford looked at the door. It was locked. He looked back at Zyla. "You locked the door, Your Majesty," Renford pointed out, his voice trembling but steady. Zyla stared at him. Then a low rumble started in his chest. It wasn't laughter. It was acclaim. He reached out, his hand large enough to crush Renford's skull, but he merely brushed his thumb over Renford's lower lip. "So I did," Zyla whispered. The king leaned in, his forehead resting against Renford's. The intimacy was overwhelming. "I have spent 10 years in the cold, 10 years without warmth. I am not a fire to be sat by," Renford said, trying to maintain some semblance of autonomy, though his body was betraying him, leaning into the king's heat. "No," Zyla roared softly, the sound vibrating through Renford's bones. "You are not a fire. You are the spark." He grabbed Renford's waist, pulling him flush against his body. The contact was searing. "You saw me. You are the first one to truly see me. And now—" Zyla buried his face in the crook of Renford's neck, inhaling deeply, his teeth grazing the sensitive scent gland there. "Mine," he roared into the skin. It wasn't a question. It was a decree. "You are mine." Morning light filtered through heavy velvet curtains, grey and unforgiving. Renford woke with a start, his heart instantly racing. He wasn't in his small, drafty apartment above the archives. He was in a bed that could comfortably sleep 5 people, buried under furs that were softer than anything he had ever touched. The canopy above him was embroidered with the crest of the House of Frostborn, a wolf devouring a star. Memory rushed back. the study, the heat, the overwhelming pressure of the king's presence. Zyla hadn't bitten him, he hadn't marked him, not fully, but he had held Renford for hours, simply breathing him in, as if Renford were oxygen, and the king had been suffocating for a decade. Eventually, exhausted by the sheer intensity of the energy in the room, Renford had passed out. He sat up, clutching the silk sheets to his chest. The room was empty. The door opened, and a woman in silver armor stepped in. She had a severe face and hair cut short like a boy's. This was Cyrilla Greymount, the captain of the King's Guard. "You're awake," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Get dressed. The king requires your presence at breakfast." She threw a bundle of clothes onto the foot of the bed. They were not Renford's clothes. They were velvet tunics, silken trousers, and boots of soft doe-skin. They were the clothes of a royal consort. I can't wear this," Renford stammered. "I need my uniform. I need to go back to the archives. Master Moorheart will be worried." Cyrilla looked at him, and for a second her expression softened. "Master Moorheart has been informed that you have been retained by the Crown for special services. Your debts have been paid. Your apartment has been vacated. Your things are being moved to the West Wing." Renford scrambled out of bed, ignoring his nudity in his panic. "Retained? I am not a prisoner. I am a free citizen." "You caught the eye of the wolf," Cyrilla said, turning her back to give him privacy, though she stood blocking the door. "Freedom is a relative concept now, Omega. The king has not slept through the night in 5 years. Last night, with you in his arms, he slept for 6 hours. Do you think he will let you go?" Renford dressed with shaking hands. He felt trapped, panicked, but beneath it all there was a treacherous thread of curiosity. Zyla hadn't hurt him. In the dark, the king had whispered through things, confessions of loneliness, of the pain of the crown. When Renford was escorted to the breakfast parlour, the atmosphere was suffocating. It wasn't an intimate meal. Sitting at the long table was King Zyla, looking refreshed, his scar less angry in the morning light. But across from him sat Zevran Whitshaw, peeling an orange with a silver knife, and an older woman with hair like steel wool, Oriana Ravensgate, the Queen Mother. When Renford entered, Zyla stopped eating. His eyes snapped to Renford, possessive and intense. He stood up. A breach of protocol, for a king does not rise for a commoner. "Renford," Zyla said, holding out a hand. "Sit." "This is absurd," Oriana snapped, slamming her cup down. "Zyla, you cannot bring a stray dog to the table and expect us to break bread with it. He is a nobody, an archivist." "He is my guest," Zyla growled, the warning clear in his tone. "And he will be treated with the respect due to—" "Due to what?" Zevran interrupted smoothly, slicing a segment of orange. "Surely not a consort. You know the council has been negotiating your union with the Princess of the Southern Isles, a political alliance necessary for our grain supply. You wouldn't jeopardize the kingdom for a pretty face and a sycophantic compliment given at a ball." Renford bristled. He walked past the chair Zyla pulled out and stood tall. "It wasn't a sycophantic compliment. And I am not a stray dog. I am a scholar." He looked at Zevran. "And I know who you are, Lord Whitshaw. I've read the tax ledgers. I know your estate hasn't paid its dues in 3 years, yet you wear sapphires the size of eggs." The room went dead silent. Zevran's smile vanished. His eyes went cold. Zyla let out a bark of laughter, a genuine, delighted sound that seemed to startle even himself. He looked at Renford with something approaching awe. "He bites," Zyla said, grinning at his mother. "I like that." "He is dangerous," Oriana whispered, looking at Renford with narrow eyes. He is an unpredictable variable, Zyla. You know what happens to variables in this court. They get eliminated, Zevran said softly. Zyla's grin vanished. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees instantly. Frost began to pattern on the window panes. Threaten him again, Zyla said, his voice dropping to that terrifying, non-human register. And I will decorate the castle walls with your insides, Zevran. He walked around the table and grabbed Renford's hand, lacing their fingers together. His grip was bruisingly tight. Renford stays, Zyla declared. And he stays in my chambers. If a single hair on his head is disturbed, I will burn this court to the ground. Renford looked at the king, seeing the desperation in his eyes. Zyla wasn't just possessing him. He was using him as a shield against his own family, his own court. Come, Zyla said, pulling Renford toward the balcony. I want to show you the kingdom. I want to show you what is yours. As Renford was dragged away, he glanced back. Zevran was still holding the knife. He wasn't looking at the king. He was looking at Renford, and he was smiling. It was a promise of violence. Renford realized then that he hadn't just walked into a romance. He had walked into a war, and the only armor he had was the unstable, terrifying favor of the Alpha King. The west wing of the Winter Palace was a contradiction in stone. While the rest of Oakhaven was built for war, sharp angles, arrow slits, and drafty corridors designed to funnel invaders into kill zones, the West Wing was a forgotten memory of a softer time. It was the Queen's Wing, uninhabited since Zyla's mother, Queen Oriana, had moved to the Dower House, and effectively the council chamber, after the death of the old king. Renford Ashthorne stood in the center of what was now his bedroom, staring at a vanity mirror framed in silver vines. The reflection staring back at him was both familiar and alien. The clothes Cyrilla had given him, a tunic of deep midnight blue velvet embroidered with silver thread, fit him perfectly, accentuating the slim line of his waist and the slope of his shoulders. But the eyes were the same. Wide, honey brown, and filled with a mixture of terror and determination. You are not a stray dog, he whispered to his reflection, repeating his words from breakfast. You are an archivist. You organize chaos. You uncover truth. But the chaos of the Frostborn court was not easily catalogued. 3 days had passed since the incident at breakfast. 3 days of silence from the king, save for the constant, silent presence of 2 hulking beta guards stationed outside his door. Renford was free to roam the West Wing, but the heavy iron gates leading to the main keep remained barred to him unless escorted. He was a bird in a gilded cage, just as Cyrilla had warned. Boredom, for a mind like Renford's, was a dangerous catalyst. He began to explore. The West Wing held a library, smaller than the great archives where he worked, but far more intimate. It was dusty, smelling of neglect and lavender. Renford ran his fingers over the spines of books that hadn't been opened in decades, poetry from the Southern Isles, treatises on botany, and, tucked away on a high shelf behind a false panel, a leather-bound journal. Renford's heart leapt. He climbed the rolling ladder, his new boots gripping the rungs, and pried the book loose. He sat on the floor, dust motes dancing in the shaft of pale sunlight, and opened it. It wasn't a journal. It was a registry of the royal nursery, dated 30 years prior. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the elegant script. Zyla Frostborn. Born of winter solstice. Weight, 9 elobase. Temperament, quiet. He turned the page. Valerius Frostborn. Born of winter solstice. Weight, 8 laubasebs. Temperament, fussy. Renford froze. Twins. The rumors were true then. Zyla had a brother, but the official history, the one Renford had memorized for his exams, stated that Valerius had died of cradle fever at 3 months. He traced the ink further down the page. The entries for Valerius stopped abruptly at age 7, not 3 months. And the final note, written in a different, jagged hand, read simply, "The shadow took the wrong one." Reading forbidden histories is a quick way to lose your eyes, little bird. Renford slammed the book shut and scrambled backward, clutching it to his chest. Standing in the doorway of the library was Petra Kingsfall. She wasn't wearing court finery today. She was dressed in riding leathers, a whip coiled at her hip. How she had gotten past the guards, Renford didn't know, but the predatory smile on her face suggested she had methods that didn't involve permission. "How did you get in here?" Renford demanded, trying to summon the courage he had displayed at breakfast. "The West Wing has many servant passages," Petra drawled, stepping into the room. She looked around with disdain. "So this is where the beast keeps his pet. I expected more. Silk. Less dust." "I am not a pet," Renford said, standing up. He hid the registry behind his back, sliding it onto a table. "And the king is not a beast." "Isn't he?" Petra laughed, a cruel, tinkling sound. She advanced on him, her boots clicking on the parquet floor. "You think you know him because he held your hand? You think you understand the Frostborn blood? Xyla is a ticking time bomb, Omega. Why do you think he has no mate? Why do you think the Council is so desperate to marry him off to a foreigner who doesn't speak our language?" She stopped inches from him, her scent, cloying lilies and metallic fear, assaulting his nose. "He killed Valerius," Petra whispered, her eyes gleaming with malice. "They were 7, playing on the battlements. Xyla got angry over a toy soldier. He pushed him, watched him fall onto the rocks below. He didn't cry. He just stared." Renford felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. "That's a lie. You weren't there." "My father was," Petra hissed. "The king is broken, Renford. His soul is iced over. He locked you in here, not to protect you, but to keep you for when the hunger takes him. He will consume you. And when he breaks you, because he breaks everything he touches, I will be there to laugh." "Get out," Renford said, his voice shaking. "I'm leaving," Petra said, turning away. "But take a piece of advice. The Southern delegation arrives tonight. The Princess Lyra is beautiful, accomplished, and, most importantly, safe. If you truly care for him, or if you just want to survive, stay in your cage. Don't come to the welcome feast. If you embarrass him in front of the Southerners, Zevran won't have to kill you. Xyla will do it himself to save his alliance." She vanished into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Renford alone with the dust and the damning registry. He looked at the book again. The shadow took the wrong one. Petra was lying, or twisting the truth. Xyla's eyes, the eyes Renford had seen in the study, were not the eyes of a cold-blooded killer. They were the eyes of someone who carried a graveyard in his heart. Renford made a decision. He wasn't going to hide. He was an archivist, and he was going to verify the source. The welcome feast was designed to impress. The great hall was decked in banners of Frostborn silver and the golden sun of the Southern Isles. Roasting boars turned on spits, and the air was thick with the smell of spiced wine and tension. Renford had not been invited. In fact, Cyrilla had explicitly told him to remain in his quarters, citing security concerns. Renford had politely nodded, waited for Cyrilla to leave, and then utilized a skill he had learned living in the archives, picking locks. The servant passages Petra had mentioned weren't hard to find if you knew how to look for airflow patterns in older architecture. He emerged onto a high balcony overlooking the great hall, hidden by the shadows of the rafters. From here, he could see everything. King Xyla sat on the high throne, wearing a crown of jagged iron. He looked magnificent and terrifying, clad in black armor that seemed to absorb the candlelight. But Renford saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his hand kept drifting to the empty space beside him where a consort should sit. To his right sat the southern delegation. Princess Lyra was indeed beautiful, a vision in gold silk with skin like warm honey. She was smiling at Xyla, engaging him in conversation, but her body language was stiff. She was terrified of him. To Xyla's left sat Zevran Whitshaw, whispering into the ear of the Queen Mother. "The barbarian king," a southern lord muttered loudly enough for the sound to carry up to the rafters. "They say he eats raw meat and couples with wolves. I can't believe we are giving our Lyra to such a savage." Xyla stiffened. He heard it. His hearing was part of the alpha physiology, enhanced and acute. "Lord Kaldor!" Xyla's voice boomed, cutting through the chatter. The hall went silent. "If the wine does not please you, I can offer you something stronger. Perhaps a taste of the steel we forge in the north?" The threat was palpable. Lord Kaldor turned pale. "Your Majesty jests," Zevran interceded smoothly, standing up. "Our northern humor is acquired. Please let us have music." The musicians began to play, a nervous, jerky tune. Renford watched Xyla. The king looked like he was vibrating. His hands were gripping the arms of the throne so hard the wood was groaning. It wasn't just anger, it was sensory overload. The smells, the noise, the hostility. It was assaulting him. Suddenly, Xyla stood up. "I need air." He stormed off the dais, ignoring the calls of his mother and the confused looks of the southerners. He headed for the side exit that led to the royal gardens. Without thinking, Renford turned and ran back through the servant tunnels, scrambling to intercept him. He burst out into the snowy garden just as Xyla did. The cold air was a relief after the stifling heat of the hall. The moon was full, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Xyla was pacing near a frozen fountain, ripping at the collar of his tunic. He was growling, low, animalistic sounds of distress. "Xyla," Renford called out, stepping into the snow. Xyla spun around. His eyes were glowing, literally glowing, a luminous, terrifying blue. His canines were extended. He looked like the monster Petra had described. "Get back!" Xyla roared, his voice distorted. "I told you to stay away. The beast is close to the surface tonight." "I'm not afraid of you," Renford said, walking closer, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. The snow crunched under his boots. "They were suffocating you in there. I saw it. You don't understand," Xyla panted, falling to his knees. He clawed at the snow, his nails leaving deep gouges in the frozen earth. "It's not just anger. It's the curse, the frost-born madness. It took my father, it took my brother, and now it takes me." "It didn't take your brother," Renford said, reaching him. He knelt in the snow, heedless of the cold seeping into his trousers. "I found the registry, Xyla. The shadow took the wrong one. That wasn't about death. That was about the madness." Xyla froze. He looked at Renford, the glow in his eyes flickering. "What do you know?" "Valerius didn't die at 3 months," Renford said softly. "He died at 7. Petra said you pushed him. But that's not what happened, is it? You didn't kill him because of a toy. You fought him." Xyla squeezed his eyes shut. He turned. The madness hit him early. He tried to tear my throat out. I pushed him, to get him off me. He fell. It was an accident. But the blood! The blood was on my hands. "You were 7, Renford said firmly. He reached out and took Xyla's face in his hands. The king's skin was burning hot, feverish against the winter air. "You were a child defending himself against a tragedy. You are not a monster," Xyla, you are a survivor." Xyla leaned into the touch, a desperate, keening sound escaping his throat. The noise. It never stops. The heartbeat of the court. The lies. It's so loud, Ren. It hurts. "Focus on me," Renford commanded gently. "Just me. Look at my eyes. Listen to my voice. I am here. I am real. I am not lying to you." Xyla opened his eyes. The glowing blue receded, leaving behind the deep, human ocean blue that Renford had fallen for. The beast receded, soothed not by magic, but by the grounding presence of an Omega who refused to be intimidated. "Why?" Xyla whispered, his hands coming up to grip Renford's wrists. "Why do you stay? I am a ruin." "Because," Renford said, a small smile touching his lips, "ruins are full of history, and I am an archivist. I quite like old, broken things." Xyla let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. He pulled Renford into his arms, burying his face in the smaller man's shoulder. They knelt there in the snow, the King of Winter clinging to the low-born scholar as if he were the only solid thing in the universe. "They want me to marry the princess," Xyla mumbled into Renford's coat. "I know," Renford said, his heart aching. "I can't," Xyla said, pulling back to look at him. "I can't bond with someone who fears me. I need someone who fights back." He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation. Xyla kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of snow and spiced wine and desperate need. Renford kissed back with equal force, his hands tangling in the king's raven hair. For a moment, the cold, the politics, and the danger ceased to exist. There was only the fire between them. A twig snapped. Xyla broke the kiss instantly, his head snapping toward the sound, the predator back in a split second. Standing at the edge of the garden, silhouetted against the palace lights, was Zevran Witshaw, and he wasn't alone. Princess Lyra stood beside him, her face a mask of shock and disgust. "Well," Zevran said, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen garden, "it seems the rumors of the king's perversions were true after all. Preferring a male servant over a royal princess. The council will be disappointed." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By the next morning, the palace was a hornet's nest. The southern delegation was insulted. Princess Lyra was reportedly packing her trunks, and the Council of Lords had called an emergency session. Renford was confined to the West Wing, but this time the guards were not the king's loyal men. They were Zevran's private militia, men with cold eyes and insignias of the serpent on their tabards. "You have destroyed him," Cyrilla Greymount said. She had managed to get into the room, though she looked like she had fought her way there. Her lip was split. "I didn't mean to," Renford said, pacing the room. Zevran set us up. He knew Xyla would go to the garden. He brought the princess there on purpose. "Of course he did," Cyrilla spat, wiping blood from her mouth. "Zevran doesn't want Xyla to have an heir. He wants the throne for himself. He's a distant cousin, close enough to claim the crown if Xyla is declared unfit." "Unfit?" "The madness," Cyrilla explained grimly. "If the council deems the king mentally unstable, cursed by the frostborn taint, they can depose him. And what better proof of instability than rejecting a vital political alliance to frolic in the snow with a commoner? They are saying you bewitched him, Renford, that you are a siren using dark magic." Renford felt sick. "What happens now?" "The trial of lineage," Cyrilla said. "It's an ancient law. To prove he is fit to rule, Xyla must endure the frost walk. He must walk the path to the shrine of the ancients, barefoot and unarmored, in the middle of a blizzard. If he survives, the gods favor him. If he dies, Zevran takes the crown." "But that's suicide!" Renford cried. "The storm outside is a whiteout. He accepted the challenge, Cyrilla said quietly. To save you. Me? Zevran demanded your execution for treason and sorcery. Xyla invoked the trial. If he wins, his word is law, and he grants you pardon. If he fails, you burn. Renford ran to the window. The storm was raging, a wall of white erasing the world. Somewhere out there, Xyla was walking into death, driven by a code of honor that Zevran was exploiting. I have to stop him, Renford said, turning to Cyrilla. I have to help him. You can't, Cyrilla said. The path is forbidden. No one enters the Frost Walk but the king. I'm not a king, Renford said, grabbing his heavy cloak. And I don't care about your laws. I care about the man. You'll die, Cyrilla warned, though she moved away from the door. Better to freeze trying to save him than burn waiting for Zevran, Renford replied. He looked at the captain of the guard. Do you have a sword I can borrow? Cyrilla hesitated, then unbuckled a short dirk from her belt and tossed it to him. Aim for the neck. Zevran's men wear armor on their chests. Renford caught the weapon. Why are you helping me? Because, Cyrilla smiled grimly. I called him a monster once too, until he took an arrow for me in the Battle of the Ice Plains. He is a good king, Renford. Bring him back. Renford slipped out into the corridor. The palace was in chaos, which worked to his favor. He moved like a shadow, avoiding the patrols, heading for the postern gate that led to the mountain path. The wind hit him like a physical blow as soon as he stepped outside. The cold was shocking, stealing the breath from his lungs. He pulled his scarf tight and squinted into the white abyss. He wasn't an alpha. He didn't have the strength or the internal heat. But he had stubbornness, and he had a map in his head. He had memorized the topography of Oakhaven years ago for an exam. He knew a shortcut to the shrine, a goat path that bypassed the main winding road. He climbed. His hands went numb. His eyelashes froze together. But he kept moving, driven by the image of Xyla kneeling in the snow, confessing his loneliness. He found him an hour later, near the ridge of the Weeping Rock. Xyla was on his knees, half buried in a drift. He was shirtless, his skin blue-white, his body racked with shivers. He wasn't moving. Xyla! Renford screamed, the wind tearing the name from his lips. He scrambled over the rocks, sliding down to the king. Xyla's eyes were open but unseeing, glazed with hypothermia. The beast inside him, the rage that usually kept him warm, had burned out. He was just a man freezing to death. No, 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 Renford sobbed, ripping off his own cloak and wrapping it around Xyla's massive shoulders. He pressed his body against the king's, trying to transfer his meager heat. Wake up, you stubborn ox! Wake up! Ren. Xyla's voice was a cracked whisper. Go back! Shut up, Renford snapped, rubbing Xyla's arms vigorously. We are walking. Now, get up! Can't! You are the king of winter! Renford shouted, slapping Xyla's cheek. You do not die in the snow. You command it. Get up, Xyla. For me. If you die, Zevran wins. If you die, I burn. Do you hear me? I burn! Something sparked in Xyla's eyes. The threat to Renford cut through the haze of death. A low growl started in his chest. No one burns my mate, Xyla grated out. He forced himself up. It was an agonizing, slow process, muscles screaming against the cold. But he stood. He leaned heavily on Renford, crushing the smaller man into the snow, but Renford held him up. That's it, Renford panted. One step, then another. They walked. It was a march of agony. But as they crested the final ridge, the shrine of the ancients came into view. A circle of standing stones that hummed with ancient magic. And standing in the center of the stones, waiting for them, was Zevran. He was flanked by 3 archers. He wasn't dressed for a trial, he was dressed for an execution. "I must admit," Zevran shouted over the wind, "I didn't think he'd make it this far. And look, he brought his pet. How poetic. You can die together." Zyla straightened. The sight of Zevran triggered something primal. The exhaustion seemed to evaporate, replaced by pure, murderous adrenaline. He shrugged off Renford's cloak. "Zevran!" Zyla roared, the sound louder than the gale. "Kill them!" Zevran ordered the archers. The arrows flew. Renford didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just saw the trajectory. He threw himself in front of the king. He felt a punch to his chest, a sharp, biting cold that spread instantly. He fell back, the snow turning red beneath him. "Ren!" The scream that tore from Zyla's throat shattered the standing stones. It wasn't human. It wasn't wolf. It was the sound of a soul breaking. The air around the king exploded. A shockwave of pure ice blasted outward, knocking the archers off the cliff. Zevran was thrown backward, slamming into the altar stone. Zyla didn't look at his enemy. He fell to his knees beside Renford. Renford looked up, his vision graying. He saw Zyla's face, twisted in absolute horror. He saw the tears freezing on the king's cheeks. "You called me. Handsome," Renford whispered, blood bubbling past his lips. "Don't forget." Then the world went white. The world was not white. It was blue, a deep, suspended, suffocating blue. Renford felt as though he were floating in the depths of a frozen ocean. There was no pain, only a numbness that started in his chest and radiated outward, turning his limbs to heavy stone. Vaguely he heard a sound, a raw, guttural animal noise that vibrated against his skin. It was the sound of a wolf howling at the moon, mourning the loss of its mate. Zyla, he thought, or perhaps he only dreamed the name. "I'm sorry. You do not get to leave me." The voice shattered the blue silence. It was commanding, terrified, and undeniably royal. "I forbid it, Renford. I forbid you to die." Renford gasped, air rushing into his lungs like swallowed shards of glass. The pain returned instantly, a searing agony in his shoulder. His eyes flew open. He was inside a cave. No, not a cave. He was inside the shrine of the ancients. The standing stones formed a protective circle, and the air within was strangely still, shielded from the blizzard raging outside by a shimmering dome of translucent ice. Hovering over him was Zyla. But not the Zyla he knew. This Zyla was terrifying. His skin was luminous, veins of glowing blue light pulsing beneath the surface. The scar on his face was no longer a jagged line of white tissue. It was a crack in the porcelain of his humanity, leaking pure, raw power. His hands were pressed against Renford's chest, directly over the wound. "Zyla!" Renford choked out. "Don't speak!" Zyla hissed, his eyes completely blue. No white, no pupil, just the essence of winter itself. The arrow, it hit the lung. "I am freezing the blood flow. I am holding you together with ice." Renford looked down. The arrow was gone. In its place was a patch of frost on his skin, sealing the torn flesh. He realized with a jolt that Zyla wasn't using medicine. He was using the curse, the very madness that the court feared. The ancient magic of the Frostborn line was the only thing keeping Renford alive. "Zevran," Renford whispered. "Gone," Zyla growled. "Buried." The king's hands were trembling violently. "I have to keep the cold in. If I let go, you bleed out. But if I hold on too long, I might freeze your heart." "You won't," Renford said, lifting a weak hand to touch Zyla's glowing cheek. The skin felt like dry ice, so cold it burned. "You aren't a monster, Zyla. You are the hearth. You are safety." The words seemed to act as an anchor. The blinding glow in Zyla's eyes dimmed, revealing the frantic man beneath the godlike power. The dome of ice around them solidified, turning the shrine into a sanctuary. "I thought I lost you," Xyla sobbed, collapsing forward until his forehead rested on Renford's uninjured shoulder. The great Alpha King, the scourge of the North, was weeping. When I saw the arrow strike, the silence in my head broke. The noise stopped. There was only you. "I'm here," Renford murmured, stroking the king's raven hair. "I'm not going anywhere." "You took an arrow for me," Xyla said, pulling back to look at him with wonder. "Why? I have given you nothing but a cage." "You gave me the truth," Renford replied softly. "And you showed me that even in the coldest winter, there is life. I love you, Xyla." "Not the king. You." Xyla froze. The confession hung in the frigid air, warmer than any fire. "Then rule with me," Xyla whispered fiercely. He leaned down, pressing his lips to Renford's, not in a kiss of passion, but a seal of binding. "If we survive this night, Renford Ashthorne, you will never bow to anyone again. You will be the Winter Queen in all but name." Outside, the storm howled, but inside the circle of their shared breath, the cold could not touch them. Xyla lay beside him, wrapping his massive body around Renford's smaller frame, using his own body heat to counter the magical frost he had placed on the wound. They lay in the dark, two broken pieces of history that had finally found their fit. 3 days later, the bells of Oakhaven tolled a mournful dirge. The great hall was draped in black. The Council of Lords sat at the high table, their faces grave. Zevran Witshaw stood at the podium, his arm in a sling, a souvenir from the avalanche that he claimed had killed the king and his Omega. "It is with a heavy heart," Zevran announced, his voice smooth as poisoned honey, "that we must accept the tragedy. The king, in his madness, took the poor scholar into the storm. Both perished. The Frostborn line has ended." A murmur went through the crowd. Princess Lyra, sitting in the front row, looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable. Petra Kingsfall was crying, though whether from grief or relief, no one could tell. "As the closest living kin," Zevran continued, placing a hand on the empty throne, "it falls to me to steward the realm until—" Boom! The heavy oak doors of the great hall didn't just open, they exploded inward. Splinters of wood and iron rained down on the guards. A freezing wind swept through the hall, extinguishing every candle instantly. The only light came from the entrance, where the midday sun silhouetted 2 figures. One was massive, wrapped in a tattered cloak that billowed like smoke. The other was leaning on him, pale and bandaged, but walking. "I do not recall," Xyla's voice rolled through the hall, amplified by the acoustics of the stone, "giving you permission to sit in my chair, cousin." Zevran turned the color of old parchment. "Ghost!" Xyla stepped into the hall. He looked terrifying. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. His clothes were stained with dried blood and mud, but he wore his authority like a second skin. He helped Renford down the steps, moving with a protective grace that made every alpha in the room instinctively bare their necks. "Not a ghost!" Renford called out, his voice thin but clear. "Evidence!" Renford pulled a book from inside his tunic, the nursery registry he had saved from the West Wing before the trek. He threw it onto the floor. It slid across the stone, stopping at the feet of the Queen Mother, Oriana. "Read it," Renford commanded. Oriana, trembling, picked up the book. She read the entry. Her eyes widened. She looked at Zevran, then at Xyla. "You knew," she whispered to Zevran. "You knew Valerius didn't die of fever." "He manipulated the records!" Renford shouted, addressing the court. "And he manipulated the king! Zevran was there the day Valerius fell. He was the one who gave the prince the toy soldier, a soldier coated in nightshade resin, a poison that causes madness and aggression, the court gasped. Xyla didn't push his brother because of a tantrum, Renford continued, leaning heavily against Xyla. He pushed him because Valerius was hallucinating and trying to kill him. Zevran poisoned the air to clear the path to the throne, and when Xyla survived, Zevran spent 20 years whispering in his ear, trying to drive him mad too. "Lies!" Zevran shrieked, drawing his sword with his good arm. "Kill them! They are traitors!" The guards hesitated. They looked at the king. They looked at the terrified council. "Anyone who draws a weapon," Xyla said softly, "freezes where they stand." He raised his hand. The moisture in the air condensed instantly, forming 1,000 sharp icicles hovering over the heads of Zevran's loyalists. Zevran looked up, realizing he had lost. With a snarl of desperation, he lunged not for Xyla, but for the Princess Lyra, intending to take a hostage. He never made it. A silver blur moved from the shadows. Cyrilla Greymount, captain of the guard, drove her sword through Zevran's chest. The Grand Advisor fell, choking on his own ambition. Silence descended on the hall. Xyla looked at Cyrilla and nodded once. Then he turned to the court. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply stood there, holding Renford's hand. "The madness ends today," Xyla said. "The lies end today. I am Xyla Frostborn. I am the king. And this—" He raised Renford's hand, kissing the knuckles in front of everyone. "Is my heart. Anyone who cannot accept that can leave Oakhaven before sunset. Anyone who stays swears loyalty to us both." Princess Lyra was the first to stand. She walked up to them, looked at Renford, and smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. She curtsied low. "Long live the king," she said, "and his consort." One by one the court knelt, even Petra, even the Queen Mother. Renford looked at Xyla. The scar on the king's face was still there, but the tension was gone. The loneliness was gone. "You're making a scene," Renford whispered. Xyla grinned, a true, boyish expression that transformed his face. "I'm a king, Ren. I'm allowed to be dramatic." Spring came late to Oakhaven, but when it arrived, it was spectacular. The purple heather bloomed across the mountains, and the ice on the eaves finally melted, dripping a rhythm of renewal. Renford sat on the balcony of the royal chambers, a blanket over his legs. His shoulder still ached when it rained, a permanent reminder of the price of love. But he didn't mind. It was a good ache. It meant he was alive. He was reading a book, a new history of the Frostborn reign, one he was writing himself. "You're working too hard." Xyla stepped onto the balcony. He looked different these days. He wore less black. Today he was in a tunic of deep forest green, and he looked relaxed. He came up behind Renford's chair and wrapped his arms around him, resting his chin on Renford's head. "I'm correcting the record," Renford said, leaning back into the embrace. "Future generations need to know that you didn't eat raw meat or couple with wolves." "Disappointing," Xyla teased, nuzzling Renford's ear. "I rather liked the wolf rumors. Kept people away." "You don't need to keep people away anymore," Renford said, turning his head to kiss the king's jaw. "You have a council that actually listens, an alliance with the South that is based on trade rather than forced marriage, and a mother who has finally retired to a monastery." "And I have you," Xyla said, his voice turning serious. He walked around the chair and knelt on one knee. It was a pose of submission, one an alpha never took. Certainly not a king. "Xyla?" "I never asked," Xyla said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I claimed you. I roared, mine, and locked you in a room. I was primitive." "You were scared," Renford corrected gently. I want to do it right, Zyla said. He opened the box. Inside wasn't a diamond or a ruby. It was a ring made of black iron, inlaid with a band of polished amber, the exact color of Renford's eyes. Renford Ashthorne, Zyla said, looking up at him with those devastatingly blue eyes. You saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I was unlovable. You saved me from the cold. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of being my mate? Not because I command it, but because you choose it? Renford looked at the ring. Iron for strength, amber for preservation. It was perfect. You foolish man, Renford whispered, tears prickling his eyes. I chose you the moment I called you handsome in that ballroom. I just didn't know it yet. Zyla slid the ring onto Renford's finger. It fit perfectly. Zyla stood up and pulled Renford into his arms, kissing him with a slow, deep passion that tasted of spring and promise. I love you, Zyla murmured against his lips. I know, Renford smiled. Now, are you going to kiss me again, or do I have to lock the door? Zyla laughed, a sound that rang out over the mountains, clear and free. He kicked the balcony door shut and turned the lock. Both, the king roared softly. Definitely both. In the end, the curse of the Frostborns was not broken by magic, nor by the sword. It was broken by a single moment of courageous honesty. Renford Ashthorne proved that true power does not lie in the ability to instill fear, but in the bravery to see the human beneath the monster. Love, like winter, can be harsh and unforgiving, but it is also the force that preserves, protects, and ultimately leads to the spring. The greatest kings are not those who conquer kingdoms, but those who conquer their own demons. And sometimes, all it takes to save a soul is one person bold enough to speak the truth when everyone else is wearing a mask. If this story warmed your heart, please remember to like this chapter, share it with your fellow romantics, and subscribe for more tales of love that defies the odds. Let me know in the comments, would you have walked into the storm for the Alpha King?